because I'm bad at it, like I said, but two, I think we're fixing problems that sometimes don't need a fix. For example, my favorite one of the videos behind me that you just saw was the little glass where they use zip ties to make a new coffee mug, basically. All you have to do is grab it with your hand and pick it up. Like, it's not necessary. To prove my point even more, I want to show you a picture real quick. This is a ship that is a Swedish ship. And they spent millions upon millions of dollars to find a green energy source to power this ship. So this is a wind-powered Swedish vessel. You see the irony in this? The people online, I think, figured out just how much of a waste of money this was. One guy said that wind-powered ships, wow, what a time to be alive. Another said, wow, we are really living in the future with these wind-powered ships. For those of you who don't know why this is ironic, they used to be powered by the wind all the time. How Columbus got here, right? So, I'm over the DIY thing. We're fixing problems that don't need to be fixed. But this becomes dangerous when we start to use this in our spiritual lives. A lot of times we try to use the do-it-yourself approach when trying to fix the issues in our lives. For example, maybe you thought to yourself, if you're not married, you're going to find the right girl, the right guy on your own. You're going to figure it out by yourself. When it comes to your career, maybe you thought, I'm going to figure out my career and what I'm supposed to be doing on my own. Maybe even more treacherously, you thought, I'm going to do this whole married thing on my own apart from God. Maybe you thought, I can get through depression on my own. Maybe you thought I can get through addiction on my own. Maybe you thought I can get through the whole infertility thing on my own. And it is dangerous to think that way. And it only leads to increased frustration. It only leads to increased depression and anxiety. But yet we fall into this same prideful trap over and over and over again because we think we can do it ourselves and we don't need help from a God who's promised to help us. So in this series, we've been learning how to find our way. And we're using the Israelites in the Old Testament to show us some examples of how they were finding their way through the wilderness into God's promised land. And we're learning through wisdom, through some of the mistakes that these Israelites made. And if we can learn through their mistakes, maybe we won't repeat some of the exact same ones. So today, if you've got your Bibles with you, if you want to use your phone, I've got this QR code again we'll pull up for you. You'll be able to follow along with the notes section that are in there because we're going to be kind of camping in two separate places. And it'll be easy just to kind of scroll through your phone if you want to use the Bible app using the code behind me. If you're not, if you've got your paper Bible, great. I'm going to be in Numbers 14 in Joshua 6. So you can go ahead and turn to Numbers 14 and you'll be able to follow right along with us. If you weren't here last week, Rob talked about how the Israelites have come out of captivity. They were finally out and they were before God, and they decided that as they were going into the promised land, they needed to send out some spies to scout out the dangers that were in the promised land. And because of fear, they realized that maybe we don't need to go in there. Maybe we're better off somewhere else. And so fear kind of took over in their discomfort. But in Numbers 14, I think it goes to a whole new level. Their fear leads them to do something, and their discomfort leads them to do something that is probably one of the gravest mistakes that they will ever make in their lives. So I'm going to start in verse 2, Numbers 14. They're in the wilderness, camped outside of the promised land, trying to figure out how to go in. And here's what happens right after what Rob taught us last week. It says, all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land to let us fall on the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Would it not have been better for us to go back to Egypt? Now, normally, I would pick on the Israelites for these statements, and don't worry, I will in just a moment. However, I can identify with them a little bit, and I'm sure many of you guys can as well. There's probably been times in your life where because of fear or because of discomfort, you've struggled to make decisions that would lead to greater fear, that would lead to greater discomfort. And I understand that they were probably looking a new situation in the eyes. They didn't know quite what to do. Moses even encourages them in the next few verses. In verse 9, we see that Moses tries to push them towards the right decision and in the right direction. He says, do not rebel against the Lord, for the Lord is with us. But right after that, we learn that there's some serious concerns with what Israel thinks. They say that after that, they thought about stoning them for encouraging them to stay close to the Lord. This is a dangerous place that they have reached, all because of their discomfort. All because that they are afraid of what's about to happen. And the worst thing that they do happens in verse 4. It says that we should choose a new leader, go back to Egypt. Now I'm going to pick on the Israelites. Think about this for a second, all right? They had just witnessed some of the most miraculous things that have ever happened in the history of our earth. These Israelites were captive in Egypt when 10 plagues were brought upon the Egyptians. Let me just remind you of a few of those. One, they saw water turn to blood. Miraculous in and of itself. They also witnessed several of their livestock die within this period. And if that wasn't enough, we also saw the firstborn of every Egyptian family die. And if that wasn't enough, we also saw an entire sea parted so that these people could walk across dry land to safety, to freedom. And if that wasn't enough, still, as their captors chased them across the sea, God brought the sea back together, killing their chasers. These Israelites, who spent their entire lives in captivity, suddenly want a new leader who through several different miracles brought them to this point. How crazy is that? Ultimately, what we see here is their discomfort leads to heavenly betrayal. This is a betrayal that's born out of doubt. Yes, there are bad reports given, but could a God who did all of those things that I just laid out before you, and I only listed pieces of what God did, would it not be obvious for them to continue following God instead of betraying him? But I almost don't even like betrayal as the word for what they're doing here. I think a more powerful word might be treason, because they have decided that they are going to go against the God who brought them to this point, who provided for them up to this point. They had lived 400 years in captivity, and yet they want a new leader. It's treason, my friends. And you know it's bad because Moses actually has to go before God after the Israelites decide they want a new leader and try to talk God basically off a cliff of trying to tell God he doesn't need to start over again. And look how God replies in verse 20. He says, I have forgiven them as you asked, talking to Moses. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on earth to their ancestors. No one has treated me with contempt will ever see it. So there's two main things we need to recognize there. In that first sentence that God speaks to Moses, he tells Moses, I forgive my people. But notice, even though there's forgiveness, there's still a consequence. God doesn't choose to flood the earth and start over again. He doesn't even give them the Sodom and Gomorrah treatment. Still, God tells the people that this current generation will never see the promised land. Their betrayal led to banishment. And I believe that their betrayal leads to banishment because God recognizes the toxic mindset that had invaded the older generation of Israelites that were leading them to this point. Because this wasn't their first time betraying God, even on this journey. Once they had crossed the sea, like I told you, they actually built a golden calf to worship instead of God. I think it was at this point God realized maybe there's some things that really need correcting. Maybe it's not just their grumbling that is the problem. I think God knows at this point that this people's mindset needs to be completely flipped, changed, retaught, and they need to learn new habits when it comes to full reliance on God. Now, once this message is relayed to the Israelites, how do you think they reacted? Probably don't even have to read the rest of the story to know it didn't go over well. Sometimes I do recognize their frustration. However, look at what they choose to do. Moses goes before them. He relays the message. And as they're deciding they're going to go forward anyways, look at what Moses says to them and how they react. Verse 42. Do not go up, Moses says, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies, for the Amalekites and the Canaanites will face you there, because you have turned away from the Lord, and he will not be with you, and you will fall by the sword. Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country. Though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp, then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. Again, if you hadn't read this story before, you could probably guess where this was going. When the followers of God choose to move, when the Israelites choose to move without God's blessing, failure is completely inevitable. It's another reason why these people's mindset was so dangerous, because they not only thought they needed a new leader, but they also thought they could accomplish what God told them to do without him. Something that isn't just corrected with teaching, but something that had to be learned over time. Because their narcissism, their pride, is what led to defeat. Just because God had forgiven their sin doesn't mean that there would not be consequences for this people. I imagine this wasn't even an overly competitive battle. I imagine this was a demoralizing defeat. But it's just another opportunity for the Israelites to learn that there are going to be consequences for their sins. I can tell you that this is true not just biblically, but it's true in our regular lives as well. Sometimes we do something wrong where even though we can be forgiven, there are still consequences for our actions. When I turned 16, I was so excited that I was finally able to drive. I got my permit. I was ecstatic. Then my dad sits me down when we get home, and he slides a little contract over to me. This contract was full of all sorts of rules, as well as consequences for breaking those rules that usually included something like losing my keys for days, weeks, or months, right? Now, I know it would be hard for you guys to imagine, but every now and then, I had a hard time keeping my little Honda Civic under the speed limit, occasionally. Then there was one day a sheriff's deputy noted the exact same thing when he pulled me over, and we had a little conversation. However, when he pulled me over, I recognized the guy that pulled me over, and it was one of my friend's dads, so I thought for sure I wasn't going to get in trouble because he was just going to let me off and let me go on my way. The ticket that I received said otherwise, and so I knew immediately that I had to do the right thing. So I called my dad, I talked to him, I told him that I had gotten a speeding ticket, which carried the consequence of losing my keys for a month. It's not something any 16-year-old boy wants to hear. However, the very next Sunday, my friend's dad also goes to our church. And so he sets me down at breakfast before church starts, and he says, "You know what, Drew? I decided to tear up the ticket." And I was ecstatic, because I thought this meant I was off the hook, right? Not a second passed once our little breakfast and conversation was done. I went straight to my dad. I did not get the keys back. But you get what I'm trying to say here? I did break the rules, and I got caught. Even though the punishment was gone, I was not going to have to pay a fine. There were going to be no points added to my license. For all intents and purposes, the punishment was gone. But there were still consequences for my actions. The same is true for our spiritual lives. If you follow Jesus, your sins are forgiven. You have received grace. However, some sins carry consequences beyond just the consequence of sin. So we have to recognize that in this story, even though the Israelites' sins were forgiven, even though that there's a good chance a lot of these people are spending eternity with God, consequences remain. And God knew that as long as his people remained disobedient, as long as he knew that these people weren't going to follow and rely on him completely, he knew that they were not going to be a people that could take over the promised land. Because the truth is, everyone in the promised land was a stronger people than the Israelites. The only difference between the two is the Israelites had God behind them. And if God was not behind them, or the Israelites weren't being faithful to what God had called them to, they had no hope in overtaking the promised land. So they had to learn lessons of disobedience while they were banished, while that generation was slowly dying off. It took 40 years, or a certain number of years' time, before they were completely gone. And now I want us to skip ahead, right? They spend 40 years in the wilderness, and there's lots of scripture that we can find that talks about those 40 years. However, let's skip ahead now. Let's see if the Israelites that were from Numbers 14 learned their lesson by Joshua chapter 6. We're going to move forward, and this is the Battle of Jericho. Now, to give you a little heads up, anytime I talk about the Battle of Jericho, I think of two things. The first thing that I always think about, if you were in any kind of Sunday school class, you probably saw this movie at some point, right? Joshua and the Big Wall, where the Jericho people would pour purple slushies on top of the Israelites. I have a hard time not picturing that. The second thing that I always think of with the Battle of Jericho, if you're a Monty Python fan, is the Frenchman that stands on top of the wall taunting all of the, I'll say, Israelites as they walk by. This is how I picture this scene unfolding. I know it's completely inaccurate, but I always imagine like a French fella on top of the walls of Jericho taunting all the Israelites as they're walking around. If you haven't seen Monty Python, I understand that's not the funniest joke in the world. If you have, it's hilarious, I promise. But I want you to understand where we are geographically as well. So I've got a map behind you. I know maps are incredibly nerdy, but this will help you understand exactly where we are. The purple line, if you're going from right to left, shows the direction in which the Israelites are marching to overtake the promised land. And so they're starting in their camp from the wilderness, and they are marching towards Jericho. Now, the other thing you've got to understand about Jericho is it's the beginning of the hill country. It's the beginning of the mountainous area. And if you're a Star Wars fan, you know it is unwise to attack somebody on the high ground. You never want to attack uphill. It's always easier to defend a spot when you're on top towards the people attacking at the bottom. So this is an unwise attacking plan from the get-go. However, God is going to issue a very specific set of instructions just so that the people know what to do. So again, we're skipping ahead. This is Joshua chapter 6. Here's the instructions that God gives to his people. He says, march around the city once with all the armed men and do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark on the 7th day. March around the city 7 times with the priests blowing trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, every one straight in. Notice how detailed the instructions is. Notice how detailed the instructions are. God is basically telling the people how to lead a parade around the city of Jericho. To give you an example of what that looks like, here is a 3D rendering of what the city of Jericho probably looked like. And so if you can see below where the outer wall takes place, the Israelites are marching around that once every day for 6 days. So what this tells us immediately that there's going to be no instant gratification when it comes to seizing the promised land. And I believe that God is testing the Israelites here. He's letting them know that they have to follow his instructions exactly if they want to overtake a place like this. It's not going to be some epic battle like something you've seen in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or anything like that. This is going to be a battle that honestly is pretty boring. I imagine there are a lot of antsy warriors sitting in the back of this parade marching around this city that are bored to tears and are just ready to get at it. But God is testing his people. Will they follow him in his lead Or will they do their own thing? Will they struggle with pride like the story we talked about before? Here's what verse 10 says. Joshua takes us to a new level as he's talking to his people before they begin the 7-day run on Jericho. It says that Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. And when I read this, I've seen this story before. I've had classes on this story before. I watched the greatest historical movie of all time in VeggieTales that retells this story. And yet, there's something I missed every time I read it. Joshua tells his people to stay silent on days 1 through 6. I want you to go back and look at verse 3, 4, and 5. God never said to do that. The only thing God did say was shout on day 7, but he never commanded his people to stay silent on days 1 through 6. So why is Joshua then taking it to another step, trying to tell the Israelites that they need to stay silent on days 1 through 6? And I think there's only one reason that Joshua would go to do such a thing, and that's because he knew that in their conquest of the promised land, that obedience was going to be key. And I'm going to be completely honest. We don't talk about this enough as a church. We don't talk about this enough as Christians living in America. We emphasize love and grace, and rightfully so. Those are very powerful actions that a Christian has received on behalf of God. But even still, we are commanded, each and every one of us, to be obedient. In fact, some of Jesus' instructions before he ever left earth commanded us to teach people to obey everything that he has commanded us. So part of every one of our jobs as Christians is not only to be obedient, but to teach it to other Christians as well. Again, we emphasize grace and love, which we should. However, obedience is something that falls right in line with what we are commanded to do as Christians. This is something that Joshua learned in his 40 years in the wilderness. He learned that if they were going to take over the promised land, if they were going to continue living under God's authority, they needed to be obedient to exactly what he called them to do. So here's what happened. They march around Jericho 6 days in a row, once a day, probably the most boring parade anyone's ever witnessed. And day 7 comes. On day 7, they march around. Here's what it says in verse 20. So the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up to the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. We see a victory here that takes place that started with God's people being obedient. But more so, we see a victory here where only God gets the glory, right? Again, what did these people do to bring the walls crashing down? We've had archaeologists that have taken away the rubble now, and they're able to see the remains of the city of Jericho. And what the scientists have said when they re-examined the remains of Jericho is that it was as if a high-grade earthquake happened just in the city of Jericho that made the walls come crashing down. These are scientists that don't exactly follow what the Bible says, but just by the remains that they pull up, they see that there was something that took place here that was magnificent. If it was done any other way, the people could beat their chests. They could get a big head. They could claim victory themselves. But the taking of the city of Jericho was something that only God was capable of doing. This was a victory where only God gets the glory. I want the band to go ahead and make their way back up. And I want us to realize something as we walk through these two stories. And it's this key point. When we are obedient, God is faithful. Now, I recognize this is the key lesson that we need to take away from the story today. But I also recognize that phrase, we are obedient, God is faithful, is honestly an oversimplification of what happens for us as Christians. I've got a few things that I feel like we need to build on top of that phrase so that our understanding is all the way there. First, when we are not obedient, God is not any less faithful. God is always faithful. I told you that even when his people were disobedient, he was faithful in his consequences for his people. Yes, he forgave them, but God's faithfulness is never less just because we are disobedient. His faithfulness is always perfect because he's an amazing God that we serve. Second, I want us to be clear that when we say, when we are obedient, God is faithful, I am not saying that God is promising us prosperity. God is not telling us that if you are obedient, then you are going to be blessed in crazy ways. You're going to be rich, you're going to drive the nicest cars, you're going to have the biggest houses, life's going to be easy. That's not what God's faithfulness means. If you've ever read any of the DC Talk books about martyrs, you understand that there are lots of people who follow God that don't prosper here on earth. There are lots of people who are obedient to God and follow God, but he is faithful in the life after this one. He is faithful in heaven. He is faithful with what he promised then. It doesn't mean that we are going to have the most abundant life here on earth. God never promises us happiness. He does promise us joy. And then the third thing that I want us to take away from this phrase, when we are obedient, God is faithful, is it's true. When we are obedient to God's commands for us, we will see faithfulness come through in amazing ways. In fact, it is something that Jesus taught, you reap what you sow. However, none of us here, none who have ever lived, will ever reach the point of perfect obedience. Nobody here is going to live a perfect life for the rest of their lives, whether you've already decided to follow Jesus or not. We can aim for perfection. In fact, that's something I always try to teach people. We should aim to be perfect. We might get close, but none of us will ever reach it. So I want to encourage all of us today to recognize that yes, obedience is key. Yes, God is going to be faithful when we are obedient. But what happens when we fall? What happens when we have our moments like when the Israelites first entered the promised land, where we're afraid, where we doubt, where we stumble with some kind of sin we've always struggled with? Well, like I said, grace is still a powerful thing. Several millennia after this took place, after Joshua and all the Israelites had already conquered the promised land, see a battle that took place far greater than some silly city walls crumbling down. It was in that conquest Jesus stood on a cross, defeated sin once and for all. And anyone who accepts Jesus has the ability to be saved by grace through faith. Great news. If you don't understand what grace is, just a couple weeks we're going to talk about it, we're going to define it, we're going to walk through what Jesus talks about when he is willing to give us grace. Because it's something we need as Christians, and it's something that we need to show the world today, because our world needs a lot more grace. So yes, we need to be obedient as God's people, because God's going to come through in amazing ways. But I'm also relieved that each and every one of us have the safety net